When did powerful queens stand toe-to-toe with the might of the medieval church, challenging its authority, defying its decrees and facing its wrath? From the Dark Ages to the dawn of the Renaissance, royal women carved their own paths, often clashing with the spiritual power that claimed dominion over souls and kingdoms. Number 12. The sorcery accusations and the Church's shadow. The year was 1305. The air in France was thick with whispers, suspicion, and the lingering scent of political intrigue. At the heart of it all stood Joan of Navarre, Queen of France and Navarre, wife of King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. Joan was a woman of intelligence and spirit, a queen who managed her own substantial inheritance with considerable skill. She ruled Navarre in her own right, a rare feat for a medieval queen, and she was known for her patronage of the arts and education, even founding the College of Navarre in Paris. But even a queen with such accomplishments could find herself ensnared in the dangerous web of accusations, especially when the Church's powerful investigative arm was involved. The accusations that began to circulate around Joan were not of political treason or financial mismanagement. They were far more sinister, touching upon the very soul: sorcery. In the early 14th century, the Church's stance on magic and witchcraft was hardening. The Dominican order in particular had been tasked with rooting out heresy, and this often extended to practices deemed superstitious or demonic. Sorcery was not just a crime against the state. It was a grave sin against God, punishable by the severest of ecclesiastical penalties, sometimes even death. The specifics of the accusations against Queen Joan were murky, but they centered on charges of practicing black magic. It was said that she had used enchanted objects, spells, and perhaps even poisons to gain influence, harm her enemies, or secure her husband's favor. One particularly notorious rumor involved a small lead figurine pierced with pins, allegedly found in her possession, a common tool associated with sympathetic magic, intended to cause suffering to an effigy subject. Such claims, even if unsubstantiated, were enough to ignite public fear and attract the unwelcome attention of the Church's inquisitors. The context for these charges was the tumultuous reign of Philip IV. Philip was a king who was constantly short of money, and who had an increasingly fraught relationship with the papacy itself, famously clashing with Pope Boniface VIII and later relocating the papacy to Avignon. While Joan was not directly involved in these grand theological and political power struggles between king and pope, the atmosphere of suspicion and the Church's heightened vigilance against perceived spiritual threats. It is worth noting that King Philip IV himself had a close relationship with the Dominicans, who often served as his confessors and intellectual advisors. This connection meant that accusations brought by these friars or investigated by them carried significant weight. The accusations against Joan were not made by common folk, but reportedly stemmed from disgruntled former courtiers or rivals within the aristocracy, perhaps seeking to undermine her influence or the king's stability. Some historical accounts suggest the charges were politically motivated, designed to destabilize the royal family or to discredit the queen for reasons lost to time. Nevertheless, once the whispers began, the machinery of the Church was compelled to respond. The accusation of sorcery was too serious to be ignored, particularly for a queen whose spiritual health was seen as intertwined with the well-being of the entire realm. While formal heresy trials against monarchs were rare, the Church's investigative apparatus, particularly the Inquisition, had the authority to investigate any accusation of sorcery, regardless of the accused's social standing. Though Joan was never formally tried or condemned by the Church, the very existence of such accusations and the need for some form of ecclesiastical inquiry or dismissal cast a long shadow over her reputation. The Church's power to investigate, even if not to directly prosecute, demonstrated its pervasive influence in the spiritual and moral lives of even the highest secular rulers. The historical record from this period, as noted by chroniclers like William of Nantes, suggests that investigations were indeed initiated High-ranking members of the church were involved, compelled to look into the claims lest they be seen as lax in their duty to God. The details remain somewhat obscured by the passage of centuries, but it is known that the accusations caused considerable distress to the queen. Ultimately, the charges against Joan of Navarre were never proven, and she maintained her position and influence as queen until her death in 1305. However, the incident serves as a stark reminder of the medieval church's ever-present shadow, its immense power to scrutinize, investigate, and potentially condemn even the most powerful individuals, using the potent fear of heresy and sorcery as its tool. The threat of spiritual judgment, even if ultimately repelled, was a formidable weapon, wielded by the church, keeping queens and commoners alike perpetually aware of its divine authority. Number 11. The Indomitable Queen and the Holy See's Dilemma. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England, was no stranger to conflict. Her life, spanning much of the 15th century, was defined by the brutal dynastic struggle known as the Wars of the Roses. She was a French princess, married to the gentle, often infirm King Henry VI, and her fierce loyalty to her husband and son, Prince Edward, propelled her into the role of a formidable military and political leader. Her opponents were the powerful House of York, led initially by Richard, Duke of York, and later by his sons, particularly Edward IV. The Church, the supreme moral and spiritual authority of the age, found itself in a precarious position, often caught between the warring factions, forced to make difficult choices that alienated one side or the other. This created a long simmering tension between Margaret and the Church, not always a direct confrontation, but a constant struggle for ecclesiastical legitimation and support. From the outset of the wars, Margaret faced challenges to her authority and the legitimacy of her Lancastrian cause. The Yorkists frequently argued that Henry VI was an incompetent ruler, chosen by God but unfit to govern, and that the true succession lay with them. The Church, through its archbishops, bishops, and papal legates, was deeply entangled in this political maelstrom. It was their role to consecrate kings, mediate disputes, and pronounce on matters of moral and divine right. When the throne itself was in dispute, the Church's stance was paramount, as detailed in the Paston Letters, a collection of family correspondence from the period. The Church's loyalties often shifted, reflecting the changing tides of war and the political pressure exerted by whichever faction held the upper hand. When the Lancastrians were dominant, the Church naturally supported them. However, when Richard of York, or later Edward IV, seized power, the Church was quick to adapt, legitimizing the new ruler, often through a solemn coronation presided over by the Archbishop of Canterbury, a high-ranking Church official. This pragmatic approach, while necessary for the Church's own survival and influence, infuriated Margaret. She saw it as a betrayal of her husband's divine right and a direct challenge to her son's rightful inheritance. One of the most profound points of contention arose during the Act of Accord. In 1460, a desperate attempt to bring peace would remain king for life. But Richard of York, or his heirs, would succeed him. Disinheriting Prince Edward, the Church, eager for an end to the bloodshed, largely supported this agreement. Margaret, however, vehemently rejected it. She saw it as a spiritual outrage, a violation of God's will, and a direct assault on her son. Her refusal to accept this ecclesiastical and political compromise set her on a collision course with those church leaders who had endorsed it. Accounts from the Croyland Chronicle illustrate the deep division within the realm, including its spiritual leadership over this pact. When Edward IV seized the throne in 1461, following battles like Towton, he was swiftly crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Church uttered pronouncements supporting his claim. Margaret, along with her loyalists, was branded a rebel. To fight against a divinely anointed king, sanctioned by the highest church authorities, was a perilous spiritual endeavor. Yet Margaret fought on, appealing to the righteousness of her cause, even as she faced the Church's tacit or explicit condemnation. Throughout her campaigns, Margaret constantly sought to garner international support, including from the papacy. However, the popes of the era, such as Pius II, were primarily concerned with broader European affairs, like the threat of the Ottoman Empire, and generally upheld the de facto ruler of England. Papal bulls would sometimes confirm the legitimacy of Edward IV, while Margaret's pleas for intervention often went unanswered, or were met with calls for peace rather than direct support for her specific claim. The Church as a whole preferred stability and a strong, unified England that could potentially contribute to crusades rather than a nation consumed by civil war. Furthermore, Margaret's ruthless tactics on the battlefield, including the use of foreign mercenaries and instances of plunder by her forces, occasionally drew censure from church leaders who deplored the violence and destruction wrought upon the land and its people. While not aimed directly at the church, the widespread devastation affected church properties and personnel, adding to the tension. By the time of the brief Lancastrian redemption of Henry VI in 1470–71, the church once again, almost instantaneously, switched its allegiance back to the restored king. But this, too, was short-lived. Following the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury in 1471, where Prince Edward was killed, and Henry VI was captured, and subsequently died, Margaret was finally defeated. The Church quickly solidified its support for Edward IV, and Margaret was eventually ransomed and returned to France. Margaret of Anjou's feud with the Church was less about theological dispute and more about the Church's crucial role in legitimizing political power. Her relentless fight for her husband's and son's claim forced the Church to constantly adjust its position, vacillating between divine right and pragmatic acceptance of the victor. This constant shifting allegiance created an underlying tension and resentment for Margaret, who saw the Church as failing in its spiritual duty to uphold the true, divinely ordained monarch. Her struggle serves as a vivid illustration of how deeply the Church was embedded in the secular power struggles of the medieval period, and how even an indomitable queen had to contend with its formidable, albeit often flexible, authority. Number 10. The English Queen and the Divine Right Question. Isabella of France, Queen of England, entered the annals of history with the chilling moniker She-Wolf of France. Born a princess, she married King Edward II of England in 1308. Her life took a dramatic turn when her husband's perceived favoritism towards male companions, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, the younger, alienated the English nobility and led to a profound crisis of governance. Isabella, once a respected queen, found herself increasingly moralized and abused. This descent into political powerlessness, however, would culminate in an extraordinary and unprecedented act, the deposition and eventual death of a reigning monarch, an act that deeply challenged the fundamental medieval concept of divine right, a concept tirelessly championed by the Church. The medieval Church upheld the doctrine that kings ruled by divine right. They were God's anointed representatives on earth, and rebellion against a king was akin to rebellion against God. This theological framework formed the bedrock of monarchical power across Christian Europe. For the Church, the deposition of a king, especially one who had been crowned and anointed, was a grave matter with profound spiritual implications. Isabella's initial attempts to influence Edward II, or to gain redress for her own grievances, were through conventional political channels. She sought the support of powerful barons and even appealed to her brother, King Charles IV of France. However, as the Despensers' influence grew, Isabella's situation became desperate. Accounts from the Chronicle of Geoffrey le Baker highlight her growing desperation and the stark reality of her husband's disregard. In 1325, Isabella traveled to France on a diplomatic mission ostensibly to settle a dispute over English lands in Aquitaine. While there, she refused to return to England, publicly denouncing Edward II and the Despensers. She formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a powerful exiled English baron, and together they launched an invasion of England in 1326. This invasion, led by the king's own wife and her paramour, was an act of profound rebellion, shattering all norms of medieval kingship and queenship. As Isabella and Mortimer gathered support, the English nobility, many of whom were fed up with Edward II and the Despensers, flocked to their banner. Crucially, the Church in England found itself in a delicate position. Archbishop Walter Reynolds, the highest ecclesiastical authority in England, along with many other bishops, had long been critical of Edward II's misrule and the Despensers' avarice. They had seen the kingdom descend into chaos, impacting the welfare of the Church and its parishioners. When Isabella and Mortimer landed, many prelates offered them tacit or even explicit support, seeing them as instruments to restore order and good governance. This was not an outright feud with the Church, but rather Isabella, forcing the Church to grapple with an unthinkable scenario. The pivotal moment came in October 1326, when Edward II fled London. Isabella and Mortimer seized control. A parliament was convened in January 1327, where the decision was made to depose Edward II. This was an unprecedented action. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Walter Reynolds, delivered a sermon famously using the Latin phrase vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God, effectively justifying the deposition by claiming it was the will of God. This was a radical interpretation of divine right, one that placed a dangerous precedent on monarchical power. The Annals Paulini, a contemporary chronicle, record the details of this momentous parliamentary decision. Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, the young Edward III. Isabella and Mortimer became the de facto rulers of England, governing through the boy king. The Church, by largely acquiescing to this deposition and even providing theological justifications for it, placed itself in a complex moral and political bind. It had upheld the divine right of kings for centuries, yet it had now implicitly sanctioned the removal of an anointed monarch by his own wife and subjects. This action stretched the boundaries of Church doctrine to its limits, reflecting the extraordinary circumstances of Edward II's reign and the widespread discontent with his rule. The subsequent death of Edward II in Berkeley Castle, likely murdered on Mortimer's orders, was a further spiritual horror. While Isabella's direct involvement in the murder remains debated, it was widely believed at the time that she and Mortimer were complicit. This act, the regicide of an anointed king, regardless of how unpopular he was a profound transgression against divine order. The Church, while not directly responsible for the murder, was forced to reconcile its earlier justifications for deposition with the horrific reality of a king's violent end. It remained largely silent on the specifics of the death, a silence that spoke volumes about the difficult position it found itself in. Isabella's power, however, was not to last. In 1330, her son, Edward III, asserting his own authority, overthrew Mortimer and later stripped Isabella of much of her power. While she lived out her days comfortably, her actions had fundamentally altered the relationship between monarchy and the Church's doctrine of divine right. Isabella of France, by orchestrating the deposition of her husband, forced the Church to publicly, or at least tacitly, wrestle with the ultimate limits of royal authority and the circumstances under which an anointed king might be removed. It was a dramatic conflict, not just with a king, but with the very theological underpinnings of medieval kingship that the Church had so meticulously constructed. Number 9. The radical saint and the Church's scrutiny. Elizabeth of Hungary, born a princess in 1207, was a woman of extraordinary piety whose devotion to Christ manifested in radical acts of charity and self-abnegation. Married at a young age to Louis IV, Landgrave of Thuringia, she embraced a life of intense spirituality, often at odds with the expectations of her noble status. After Louis's premature death during the Sixth Crusade in 1227, Elizabeth's life became a profound example of Christian charity, but it also brought her into direct conflict with her own family and, more subtly, with certain segments of the church, particularly those tasked with managing her finances. And spiritual life. The Church in the 13th century was deeply committed to promoting charity and care for the poor. Figures like Francis of Assisi had recently inspired new religious movements, emphasizing poverty and service. However, Elizabeth's brand of charity was extreme even for her time, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable for a royal widow. Her actions became a source of scandal and concern, especially to her family, who were also powerful members of the church establishment. Upon her husband's death, Elizabeth renounced her royal status and committed herself to a life of poverty and service to the sick and the poor. She dismissed her ladies-in-waiting, gave away her fine clothes and jewels, and used her dowry and other resources to build hospitals and feed the hungry. De Vita Sanctae Elizabethae, a collection of accounts from her confessors and companions, provides vivid details of her rigorous asceticism and boundless generosity. She would personally attend to the sick, clean their wounds, and share her food with beggars, even bringing them into her own home. This radical departure from aristocratic norms immediately put her at odds with her late husband's family, especially her brother-in-law, Henry Raspe. Henry, acting as regent for Elizabeth's young son Hermann, was aghast at her perceived extravagance and wastefulness. He saw her actions as squandering valuable family assets and undermining the dignity of the royal house. He feared that her excessive charity would impoverish her son and diminish the family's standing. From Henry's perspective, Elizabeth was not fulfilling her duties as a noblewoman, a mother, or a responsible steward of her wealth. Henry Raspe, a powerful secular ruler, also had significant influence within the local church hierarchy. He appealed to various ecclesiastical authorities, including Conrad of Marburg, Elizabeth's stern confessor, who had been appointed by Pope Gregory IX to guide her spiritual life. Conrad himself, while ultimately a champion of Elizabeth's sanctity, was an extremely strict and ascetic man who subjected Elizabeth to harsh spiritual disciplines, testing her devotion through severe penances and obedience. While he guided her, his methods were not without controversy, and his authority was derived from the church. The conflict centered on Elizabeth's management of her wealth and her son's inheritance. Henry Raspe accused her of financially ruining the family through her charitable endeavors. He argued that the funds Elizabeth was dispensing belonged to her son or the state, not to her, to give away freely. This prompted a subtle yet significant intervention by church authorities. While the Pope eventually canonized her, the immediate response from certain churchmen was one of scrutiny and control. Conrad of Marburg, acting as a direct representative of the Pope, had the authority to oversee Elizabeth's financial affairs and her spiritual direction. He was tasked with ensuring her piety was genuine and not a form of delusion, and that her actions were not leading to scandal. This meant that every penny she spent, every act of charity, was subject to review and approval. This imposed a form of ecclesiastical control over her personal life and wealth, which she chafed against at times even while she submitted to Conrad's spiritual authority. Furthermore, some local clergy and nobles who were concerned with the upkeep of their own estates and feudal obligations saw Elizabeth's radical poverty as a challenge to the established social order. They feared it might inspire others to abandon their responsibilities or disrupt the economic stability of the region. Church, while advocating charity in principle, also sought to maintain order and hierarchy. Elizabeth's extreme path pushed against these norms. The feud, therefore, was not a direct accusation of heresy, but a deep-seated tension between Elizabeth's personal, radical interpretation of Christian charity and the pragmatic institutional concerns of her family and the Church's oversight. While the Pope ultimately recognized her sanctity, culminating in her rapid canonization just 4 years after her death, her life highlights the internal struggles within the medieval church, Regarding the practical application of radical piety, Elizabeth of Hungary's unwavering devotion, despite the scrutiny and familial opposition, demonstrated the powerful and sometimes disruptive force of individual faith within the rigid structures of both medieval society. Number 8. The Hohenstaufen heiress and the papal claim. Constance of Sicily. Holy Roman Empress, Queen of Sicily, was a woman whose destiny was intertwined with the immense power struggle between the Holy Roman Emperors and the papacy. Born in 1154, she was the posthumous daughter of Roger II, the revered founder of the Kingdom of Sicily. Her marriage to Henry VI, son of Frederick Barbarossa, united the powerful Hohenstaufen dynasty of Germany with the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, creating an empire that encircled the Papal States from north and south. This union, and particularly the future of Sicily, became a central point of contention in a feud that lasted for decades between the papacy and the Hohenstaufen rulers. With Constance at its heart, the Kingdom of Sicily, which included not just the island but also the southern Italian mainland, was a unique entity in medieval Europe. It was a papal fief, meaning its rulers owed allegiance to the Pope as their feudal overlord. Papacy, viewing itself as the rightful suzerain, was extremely anxious about the prospect of a united German Sicilian Empire under the Hohenstaufens. Such a power would threaten the very independence and security of the Papal States, potentially reducing the Pope to a mere chaplain of the Emperor. The records of the Papal Chancellery from this period consistently show this deep-seated fear of Hohenstaufen encirclement. When Henry VI died prematurely in 1197, Constance, now a widow and pregnant, found herself in a precarious but powerful position. She was the rightful heir to Sicily, and her unborn child would be the sole legitimate claimant to both the German imperial throne and the Sicilian kingdom. The Pope, at the time Innocent III, was one of the most assertive and powerful pontiffs in medieval history. He immediately saw an opportunity to reassert papal suzerainty over Sicily and to break the Hohenstaufen grip on the region. The feud intensified around the legitimacy of Constance's own rule in Sicily and, crucially, the succession of her son Frederick II. Constance, while a Hohenstaufen, was also a devout Catholic who understood the importance of securing papal approval for her son's claim to Sicily. She knew that without the Pope's recognition, Frederick's rule would be constantly challenged by rival claimants and the powerful local barons who often sided with the papacy. The negotiations between Constance and Innocent III were fraught with tension as detailed in the Gesta Innocentiae Papae III. Constance sought papal recognition for her son as King of Sicily, while Innocent III demanded significant concessions. He insisted on specific guarantees of Sicilian autonomy from the empire, the upholding of ecclesiastical liberties, the Church's right to govern its own affairs without secular interference, and the payment of annual tribute to the Holy See as suzerain. These were not mere diplomatic niceties. They were fundamental demands that would define the future balance of power in Italy. Critical point of contention was the issue of Sicily's independence from the Holy Roman Empire. Papacy wanted to ensure that the crowns of Sicily and the empire would never be permanently united in one person. To prevent the encirclement they so feared, Constance, while fiercely protective of her son's rights, understood the necessity of compromise to secure his future. In 1198, Constance took a momentous step. She had her infant son, Frederick, crowned King of Sicily, and crucially, placed him under the direct guardianship of Pope Innocent III. This act, documented in various chronicles and papal letters, was a remarkable concession. She acknowledged the Pope's feudal overlordship, giving him unparalleled influence over her son's upbringing and the governance of Sicily. In return, the Pope confirmed Frederick's right to the Sicilian throne. This was a tactical retreat for Constance, sacrificing immediate control for long-term legitimacy. Constance died shortly after this arrangement, in 1198. Her death did not end the feud, but transformed it, placing the guardianship of Frederick II directly in the hands of the Pope. Innocent III now had the challenge of raising a Hohenstaufen prince while simultaneously trying to prevent him from becoming the very imperial threat he had always feared. The long-term consequences of this arrangement would define the tumultuous relationship between Frederick II and the papacy for decades, but it was Constance's initial decision to seek and accept the Pope's guardianship that set the stage for this epic struggle. Constance of Sicily's feud with the papacy was not a direct military conflict, but a high-stakes diplomatic and political chess match over the legitimacy of her son's inheritance and the future of an entire kingdom. Her willingness to concede papal suzerainty and even guardianship, while a strategic move to secure her son's throne, demonstrated the immense power the Church wielded over temporal rulers, even those from the most powerful imperial dynasties. Her actions highlight the delicate balance between royal authority and papal claims in medieval Europe, where spiritual legitimacy was often the ultimate arbiter of power. Number 7. The Empress Regent and the Papal Revolution. Empress Agnes of Poitou, Holy Roman Empress and Regent, found herself at the epicenter of a cataclysmic confrontation that would redefine the relationship between secular and spiritual power. Born around 1025, she married Emperor Henry III, one of the most powerful rulers of his age. When Henry III died unexpectedly in 1056, Agnes was left as regent for her 6-year-old son, Henry IV. Her regency coincided with the nascent stages of the Gregorian reform movement, a radical push within the Church to assert its independence from secular control and to cleanse itself of perceived corruption. This convergence of a vulnerable regency with a revolutionary papacy ignited a deep and enduring feud. At the heart of the conflict was the issue of lay investiture, the practice by which secular rulers appointed bishops and abbots, investing them with the symbols of their spiritual office. For centuries, emperors had exercised this power, viewing bishops as crucial vassals and administrators. However, the reformist popes, starting notably with Leo IX and culminating with Gregory VII, condemned this as simony, the buying or selling of ecclesiastical privileges. They argued that only the Pope and the Church had the right to appoint clergy, freeing the Church from temporal interference. Agnes, as regent, initially tried to maintain the established order. She appointed bishops and managed the Church's affairs within the empire as her husband had done. However, the reformers, based largely in Rome and Cluny, viewed her actions as a continuation of unacceptable secular domination. Accounts from Lament of the German Church and other reformist tracts vividly portray their outrage at lay control over spiritual appointments. The power vacuum created by a child emperor and a female regent provided the reformers with an unprecedented opportunity. While Agnes initially sought to cooperate with the reform-minded Pope Victor II, his death in 1057 plunged the papacy into a period of instability. Agnes, attempting to exert imperial influence, supported various papal candidates, but the Reform Party was determined to elect popes who would be independent of imperial control. The turning point came in 1059 with the papal election decree issued by Pope Nicholas II. This decree significantly curtailed imperial influence in papal elections, placing the power solely in the hands of the cardinal bishops. This was a direct blow to the traditional imperial right to approve papal elections, and it was enacted during Agnes's regency, essentially without her direct consent or recognition. This was a clear assertion of papal independence and a challenge to imperial authority. The true escalation of the feud, however, came with the infamous coup of Kaiserswerth in 1062. A group of powerful German magnates, led by Archbishop Anno II of Cologne, abducted the young Henry IV. This was a dramatic blow to Agnes's authority, effectively removing her from the regency. While the coup was primarily a secular power play, it was deeply intertwined with the church reform movement. Archbishop Anno and his co-conspirators were sympathetic to the reformers, and their actions aimed to weaken the imperial household, which they viewed as resistant to the church's agenda. The chronicler, Lambert of Hersfeld, describes this event as a critical turning point. After the coup, Agnes retreated to a convent in Rome, dedicating her life to piety. Her relinquishment of power, while voluntary in appearance, was heavily influenced by the political and ecclesiastical pressures she faced. The reformers, having gained control of the young emperor, were now in a better position to push their agenda. The feud culminated in the investiture controversy under Gregory VII, who famously excommunicated Henry IV in 1076. While Agnes was no longer the active regent, her regency had paved the way for this confrontation. Her initial attempts to maintain traditional imperial control over the church, coupled with the reformers' relentless drive for ecclesiastical autonomy, created an environment where such a dramatic clash became inevitable. The reformers, sensing weakness in the regency of a woman and a child, had pushed their agenda with unprecedented vigor. Agnes of Poitou' feud with the church was not a direct confrontation where she openly defied papal decrees. Instead, it was a profound clash of ideologies and power structures, with Agnes, as regent, representing the old imperial order that the revolutionary reform movement sought to dismantle. Her regency became the crucial battleground where the church first asserted its independence from lay authority, with such force setting the stage for centuries of conflict between the spiritual and temporal powers in Europe. Her story illustrates how deeply intertwined the personal fate of a queen could be with the vast seismic shifts occurring within the medieval church. Number 6. The excommunicated queen and the Pope's judgment. Joanna, the First of Naples, born in 1326, reigned as Queen of Naples and Countess of Provence for nearly 4 decades. Her long rule was marked by political turmoil, dynastic intrigue, and, most notably, a dramatic and enduring feud with the papacy. The Kingdom of Naples, a wealthy and strategically important territory in southern Italy, was a papal fief, meaning its rulers were vassals of the Pope. This feudal relationship gave the papacy immense leverage over Joanna, a leverage it would not hesitate to use when her reign faced its greatest cuspidant, Andrew of Hungary. Joanna's early life was complicated by her marriage to Andrew, a cousin, arranged to unite the Neapolitan and Hungarian branches of the Angevin dynasty. The marriage was deeply unhappy, and Andrew's ambition to be crowned king rather than merely consort caused significant friction within the Neapolitan court. In September 1345, Andrew was brutally murdered at Aversa. Suspicion immediately fell upon Joanna and her inner circle, including her lover and cousin Louis of Taranto, whom she would later marry. The murder sent shockwaves across Europe. Andrew's brother, Louis the Great of Hungary, vowed revenge. But it was the papacy that launched the most significant investigation. Pope Clement VI, then residing in Avignon, considered himself Joanna's feudal overlord and guardian. The murder of a queen's husband, especially under such suspicious circumstances, was not only a grave secular crime, but a profound moral and spiritual offense. The Pope had a vested interest in the stability of his vassal state and the perceived righteousness of its ruler. Clement VI immediately ordered a formal investigation into Andrew's death. He dispatched Cardinal Bertrand de Daux, a papal legate, to Naples, with explicit instructions to conduct a thorough inquiry and to hold Joanna accountable if she was found complicit. This was not a mere request. It was a papal command, backed by the full moral and spiritual authority of the Holy See. The records from the Avignon papacy show the intense focus Clement VI placed on this case. Joanna initially attempted to cooperate, but her actions and her swift marriage to Louis of Taranto, whom many suspected of complicity in Andrew's murder, only deepened the Pope's suspicions. Louis of Hungary launched a military invasion of Naples, accusing Joanna of regicide and fratricide. Joanna and Louis of Taranto fled to Provence, which was also under Joanna's rule. It was during her time in Provence that Joanna made a desperate move. She traveled to Avignon in 1348, the seat of the papacy, to personally plead her case before Clement VI. She presented her defense denying any involvement in Andrew's murder, claiming innocence and blaming a conspiracy of nobles. She was young, modest, and persuasive. She was also prepared to offer a substantial concession. She sold the city of Avignon itself to the papacy for 80,000 gold florins. This was a strategic political maneuver aimed at securing papal favor and financial resources for her return to Naples. Pope Clement VI, after hearing her case and benefiting from the Avignon sale, issued a bull in 1352 largely exonerating Joanna of direct involvement in the murder. He concluded that, while she was perhaps negligent in preventing it or simply misguided, there was insufficient proof of her direct complicity. This was a major victory for Joanna, seemingly ending the feud with the papacy. However, the peace was fragile. Decades later, as the Western Schism tore the Church apart, Joanna's feud with the papacy reignited with catastrophic consequences. She had initially supported Pope Clement VII, the Avignon Pope, against Pope Urban VI, the Roman Pope. Urban VI, a fiery and politically ambitious pontiff, viewed Joanna's support for his rival as an act of treason against him, as her feudal overlord. He saw her as an enemy of the true Church. In 1380, Pope Urban VI took the extraordinary step of excommunicating Joanna, the First of Naples, and declaring her deposed from her kingdom. He then offered the crown of Naples to Charles of Durazzo, a distant cousin of Joanna's and a loyal supporter of the Roman papacy. This was a direct, spiritual and temporal assault on Joanna's reign, wielding the ultimate weapon of papal authority: excommunication and deposition. Chronica Minor of the period document Urban's fierce condemnation of Joanna. This papal judgment was not merely symbolic. Charles of Durazzo, backed by Urban VI's blessing and funds, invaded Naples. Joanna, despite her long reign and resilience, found herself without sufficient support. She was besieged in Castelnuovo, captured, and eventually murdered in 1382, likely on Charles's orders. Joanna I's long and tumultuous reign demonstrates the formidable power of the papacy over its feudal vassals. From the initial investigation into her husband's murder to her ultimate excommunication and deposition during the Great Schism, the Church's judgment was a constant, inescapable force in her life. Her feud with the papacy, rooted in a scandalous crime and escalating into a struggle for ultimate authority, shows how spiritual pronouncements could translate directly into the loss of a crown and, tragically, a life. Number 5. The Iron Regent and the Papal Overreach. Blanche of Castile, Queen of France and regent for her son Louis IX, was a woman of immense strength, piety, and political acumen. Born in 1188, she was the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and married to Louis VIII of France. Upon her husband's premature death in 1226, she faced the monumental task of governing a kingdom threatened by rebellious barons and the ongoing aftermath of the Albigensian Crusade in the south. While Blanche was a devout Catholic and a staunch defender of the faith, even supporting the brutal suppression of heresy, she also engaged in a persistent and subtle feud with the papacy over the precise boundaries of ecclesiastical authority and the independence of the French crown. The 13th century papacy, under powerful pontiffs like Gregory IX, was at its zenith, asserting its right to intervene in the temporal affairs of kingdoms across Europe. Popes claimed the right to levy taxes on church property for crusades, to appoint bishops without royal consent, and to judge cases in ecclesiastical courts that secular rulers believed fell under their jurisdiction. Blanche, while deeply religious, was fiercely protective of royal prerogative and the sovereignty of France. One of the primary areas of contention was taxation. Papacy frequently sought to impose levies on French church property to fund various crusades, including those in the Holy Land and against heretics in Europe. Blanche, as regent, recognized the spiritual importance of these causes, but resisted papal demands that she viewed as excessive or infringing on the crown's right to control its own finances. She argued that the French clergy and kingdom already contributed significantly, and that excessive papal demands weakened the kingdom's ability to defend itself or provide for its own people. Accounts from various royal ordinances of the period, particularly the Établissement de Saint-Louis, hint at the ongoing negotiation and resistance to these demands. Another significant point of friction was the extent of ecclesiastical court jurisdiction. The Church's courts handled not only purely spiritual matters like heresy, marriage, and moral offenses, but also cases involving clergy, church property, and even at times individuals involved in disputes that could be construed as spiritual. Blanche, backed by her royal advisors, argued that many of these cases properly belonged to royal courts, preserving the king's judicial authority and revenue. This led to numerous disputes and appeals to the Pope, with Blanche consistently asserting the king's ultimate authority within his own realm. The Albigensian Crusade, though largely concluded by Louis VIII, left a legacy of simmering resentment and the ongoing presence of the Inquisition in southern France. While Blanche was a fervent supporter of crushing heresy, even strengthening the Inquisition's presence, she also resisted papal attempts to bypass royal authority in its operations. She insisted that royal officials must be present during inquisitorial proceedings and that the king's justice should not be entirely supplanted by ecclesiastical tribunals. This was a delicate balance, upholding the faith while defending royal sovereignty. Papal legates, direct representatives of the Pope, were frequently sent to France, often with mandates to levy taxes, intervene in disputes, or assert papal authority. Blanche, ever vigilant, treated these legates with a mixture of respect and firm resistance. She would listen to their demands, but often found reasons to delay, modify, or outright refuse those that she believed undermined the French crown. Her actions were not outright defiance, but a shrewd and consistent defense of French royal independence. Chroniclers like Matthew Paris, while often critical of her foreignness, acknowledged her formidable will and political skill in dealing with both secular and ecclesiastical powers. One example of her firmness was her response to a papal interdict on the University of Paris in 1229. Stemming from a student riot, Pope, outraged, suspended lectures and forbade masters from teaching. Blanche, recognizing the importance of the university to French intellectual life, worked to mediate the dispute and eventually secured its reopening, though she had to navigate the Church's anger carefully. Blanche's feud with the papacy was less about theological disagreement and more about a determined struggle to define the precise relationship between the French monarchy. She championed the concept of a strong, independent French kingdom, asserting its authority in matters of taxation, justice, and the appointment of clergy, even while remaining deeply pious and loyal to the Catholic faith. Her regency set a powerful precedent for future French monarchs, establishing a tradition of robust royal independence that would eventually lead to the Gallican liberties, a specific set of rights of the French Church and the French king against the Pope in later centuries. Blanche of Castile, the Iron Regent, proved that a queen could be both a zealous defender of the Church and a fierce guardian of royal sovereignty, even when those two powerful forces came into subtle yet persistent conflict. Number 4. The Lioness of Aquitaine and the Papal Chains. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France and later Queen of England, was arguably the most powerful and influential woman of the High Middle Ages. Born around 1122, she inherited the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, making her one of the most desirable brides in Europe. Her life, marked by 2 royal marriages, crusades, and decades of political maneuvering, brought her into repeated, dramatic, and often direct conflict with the papacy and the Church's authority, particularly concerning matters of marriage, divorce, and female agency. Eleanor's first marriage was to Louis VII of France in 1137. The union was strained from the start, characterized by personality clashes and a lack of a male heir. After several years, the marriage was further complicated by their joint participation in the Second Crusade. During this arduous campaign in the Holy Land, Eleanor's independent spirit and unconventional behavior, including her alleged close ties with her uncle Raymond of Antioch, scandalized many churchmen accompanying the crusade. Chroniclers, like William of Tyre, while chronicling the crusade, hint at the growing disquiet surrounding Eleanor's actions. Upon their return to France, the issue of annulment became paramount. In medieval Europe, divorce, as we understand it, did not exist. Marriages could only be dissolved by the Church through an annulment which declared that the marriage had never been valid in the first place, usually on grounds of consanguinity, blood relation, or other canonical impediments. Louis VII sought an annulment. Eleanor herself likely desired it, as she felt stifled by Louis. And the French court, the papacy, specifically Pope Eugenius III, was initially reluctant to grant an annulment. The Church viewed marriage as a sacred sacrament, indissoluble except under very specific conditions. Annulments for kings were politically sensitive, as they could undermine legitimacy and destabilize kingdoms. Moreover, granting an annulment based on consanguinity, when a male heir was desired, was a common, if often abused, loophole. However, the Pope feared weakening the French monarchy by allowing a precedent of easy annulment. For a time he even tried to reconcile the couple, notably at a meeting at Vézelay, where he attempted to symbolically strengthen their bond. Despite papal efforts, the marriage was irredeemable. In 1152, after 15 years and 2 daughters, the annulment was finally granted by a council of French bishops at Beaugency on the grounds of consanguinity, within the prohibited degrees. Eleanor and Louis were fourth cousins, a common enough relationship among royalty that it often required a papal dispensation. The swiftness of the annulment, without direct papal approval on all technicalities, suggests political pressure and the Church's acknowledgement of the marriage's irretrievable breakdown. This decision freed Eleanor to almost immediately marry Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, a much more powerful and ambitious man who would soon become King Henry II of England. This second marriage, just weeks after the annulment, caused further consternation among some church figures who viewed it as scandalous haste. Eleanor's life as Queen of England brought new clashes with the Church. Her support for her sons in their rebellion against Henry II in the 1170s, which led to her prolonged imprisonment, saw her at odds with church figures who preached obedience to the anointed king. While her conflict was primarily with her husband, the Church, in its role as upholder of peace and order, implicitly condemned her rebellious actions. Moreover, Eleanor was a patron of courtly love, a literary tradition sometimes viewed with suspicion by the stricter elements of the Church for its emphasis on romantic rather than purely spiritual love. Even after Henry II's death and her release, Eleanor continued to exert immense influence. During the reigns of her sons, Richard the Lionheart and John, she acted as regent, diplomat, and political strategist. Her active political role, though largely accepted, given her unique status, often pushed against the Church's traditional views on the limited public sphere for women. While the Church generally confined women to domestic and spiritual roles, Eleanor defied these expectations through sheer force of personality and hereditary right. Perhaps the most significant, though indirect, feud with the Church involved Eleanor's enduring legacy as a powerful, independent female ruler. Her very existence challenged the patriarchal structures championed by the medieval Church, which often promoted female subservience and obedience. Her annulment from Louis VII, initially resisted by the papacy, demonstrated the limits of church power when confronted with the determined will of royalty and pressing political necessity. Her subsequent political career, conducted with remarkable vigor well into her 80s, solidified her image as a queen who transcended traditional gender roles, and by doing so, subtly challenged the societal order. Eleanor of Aquitaine's long and extraordinary life saw her navigate and at times directly confront the papacy's authority over marriage, political stability, and gender roles. Her ability to secure an annulment against initial papal reluctance and her subsequent long and powerful political career cemented her status, demonstrated the complex and often contested relationship between secular power and the formidable authority of the medieval church. Number 3. The Empress, the Pope, and the heresy hunt. Theodora, Byzantine Empress and wife of the Emperor Justinian I, was one of the most powerful and controversial women in the history of the Byzantine Empire. Born into humble beginnings around 500 CE, she rose through the ranks of society to become an empress who exerted immense influence on policy, law, and crucially, religious affairs. Her strong support for Miaphysitism, a Christian theological position distinct from the prevailing Chalcedonian orthodoxy, brought her into a complex and often direct feud with the papacy and various factions within the church. As the Byzantine Empire, the central theological dispute of the 6th century involved the nature of Christ. The Council of Chalcedon, in 451 CE, had affirmed that Christ had two natures, divine and human, united in one person. This Chalcedonian orthodoxy was championed by the popes in Rome and largely supported by the imperial court in Constantinople. However, a significant portion of the Christian East, particularly in Egypt, Syria, and Armenia, adhered to Miaphysitism, which held that Christ had a single unified nature, divine and human. This was often perceived as a heresy by Chalcedonianists. Theodora, as chronicled by figures like Procopius in his Secret History, was a fervent Miaphysite. She used her immense influence to protect and promote Miaphysite clergy and communities, often against the wishes of her husband, Justinian, and the Chalcedonian hierarchy. While Justinian himself sought to unify the empire under a single religious doctrine, he often pursued a policy of compromise or tolerance, largely due to Theodora's persistent advocacy. The feud with the papacy became over during the Three Chapters controversy. Justinian, in an attempt to reconcile with the Miaphysites, issued an edict condemning 3 specific writings or chapters from the Council of Chalcedon. This move was intended to appease the Miaphysites, but deeply offended the Chalcedonian West, and particularly the Pope Vigilius. The Pope viewed the condemnation as an attack on Chalcedonian orthodoxy itself and a dangerous capitulation to heresy. Theodora played a key role in pressuring Justinian to pursue this policy. Her influence was so strong that when Pope Vigilius initially refused to condemn the 3 chapters, she worked to ensure he was brought to Constantinople to be pressured. Vigilius was effectively detained in the capital for years. Theodora, through her political maneuvering and direct interventions, put immense pressure on the Pope to accept the condemnation. Accounts from Liber Pontificalis, the Book of the Popes, detail Vigilius's agonizing struggle. Under duress, he eventually issued the Judicatum, condemning the 3 chapters. However, this action provoked outrage in the West, where many bishops accused him of betraying orthodoxy. Vigilius subsequently retracted his condemnation, then re-condemned it, caught between the imperial will, heavily influenced by Theodora, and the strong opposition from Western bishops. Theodora's determination to support Miaphysitism meant she often worked to undermine Chalcedonian clergy, whom she viewed as enemies. She was known to protect Miaphysite leaders, provide them refuge, and even arrange for their appointments to key positions, directly challenging the ecclesiastical authority of Orthodox patriarchs and bishops. Procopius, though biased, portrays her as a relentless and often ruthless proponent of her religious views, unafraid to confront anyone who stood in her way, including powerful church figures. Her actions went beyond. Theodora was instrumental in securing the appointment of sympathetic patriarchs to key sees, sometimes through questionable means. For example, she ensured the election of Patriarch Anthemus of Constantinople, a known Miaphysite sympathizer. When Pope Agapetus I traveled to Constantinople and exposed Anthemus's views, securing his deposition, Theodora continued to protect Anthemus. Her direct involvement in such high-level ecclesiastical appointments, often bypassing or defying established church procedures, represented a significant assertion of imperial and specifically her own power over the church. The feud with the papacy was not a theological debate she personally engaged in, but a political and spiritual struggle she orchestrated. She constantly pushed her husband, the emperor, to adopt policies that favored her theological leanings, often putting him at odds with the papacy and the Chalcedonian Church. Theodora's steadfast support for Miaphysitism ensured that this theological divide remained a central issue of the empire, despite attempts at imperial and papal unity. Her feud with the Church was a testament to her immense power and willingness to challenge the spiritual establishment, to advance her own religious convictions and protect those who shared them. Number 2. The Serpent Queen and the Bishop's Curse. Fredegund, Queen of Neustria, was a figure of legendary cruelty and ambition in the early Frankish kingdom. Born into humble origins around 545 CE, she rose to power through a series of ruthless maneuvers, ultimately becoming the wife of King Chilperic I. Her life was a bloody tapestry of political intrigue, murder and relentless power struggles, oft pinning her in her Dopstrogas. Her nemesis in this feud was not a single pope, but a succession of bishops, and the very principle of Christian morality and law that the Church sought to uphold. Fredegund's ascent began with the brutal removal of Chilperic's previous wife, Galswintha, likely murdered on Fredegund's orders. This act ignited the infamous Frankish Civil War, a decades-long vendetta with Galswintha's sister, Brunilda of Austrasia, another powerful queen. This personal vendetta bled into every aspect of Frankish life, including the church. Primary source for Fredegund's life is Gregory of Tours, History of the Franks. Gregory, a bishop himself, paints a vivid and damning portrait of Fredegund, consistently portraying her as a villainous, immoral force who routinely defied Christian teachings and committed unspeakable acts. His narrative is filled with accusations of murder, treachery, and sacrilege, making it clear that her actions were in direct opposition to the moral standards the Church tried to impose. One of Fredegund's most direct and dramatic feuds with the Church involved her contempt for bishops who dared to speak out against her. Bishop Praetextatus of Rouen was a prime example. Praetextatus had presided over the wedding of Mirovesh, Chilperic's son, to Brunhilda, an act that deeply angered Fredegund, who saw it as a threat to her own children's succession. She orchestrated his exile and later, after his return, arranged his murder. Gregory of Tours describes how Fredegund, feigning illness, lured the bishop to her side and had him fatally stabbed. This was not just a political assassination. It was the murder of a consecrated bishop, an act of grave sacrilege in the eyes of the Church. Such an act undermined the sanctity of the clergy and challenged the Church's authority to protect its own. Fredegund's list of alleged victims was long and included her own stepsons, rivals, and various members of the Frankish aristocracy. Each of these acts, particularly those involving poison or assassination, was a direct violation of Christian tenets and drew the implicit or explicit condemnation of the Church. While no pope directly excommunicated her, the chroniclers, most a queen in that era, most of whom were clerics, made it abundantly clear that her action put her beyond a pale. Of Christian conduct, Gregory of Tours, who personally knew her, and Chilperic did not mince words, essentially delivering a moral judgment against her. Another point of conflict arose from Fredegund's attempts to seize church property. Like many ambitious rulers, she saw church lands and wealth as potential resources for her own power. Such Appropriations were strongly condemned by bishops who viewed them as violations of divine law and the rights of the Church. Although the specific details are sparse, it is clear that she frequently disregarded the Church's claims to immunity and property rights, further fueling the animosity between her and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Even beyond her violent acts, Fredegonde's reputation for unrestrained ambition and moral depravity represented a fundamental challenge to the Church's efforts to civilize the Frankish elite and instill Christian values. Her disregard for marital fidelity, her penchant for schemes and revenge, and her willingness to use any means to achieve her goals stood in stark contrast to the piety and justice that the Church promoted. Her feud was not a theological dispute, but a clash of worldviews, the Church's moral order versus Fredegonde's brutal realpolitik. Fredegonde died in 597 CE, having outlived many of her enemies and rivals. Her son, Clothar II, eventually reunified the Frankish kingdom. The Church, through its chroniclers, ensured that Fredegonde's legacy was one of infamy. Her story is a dramatic illustration of the limitations of the Church's moral authority when confronted by an utterly ruthless secular ruler, yet also a testament to the Church's enduring power to shape historical memory and deliver a lasting spiritual condemnation. The Serpent Queen and the bishops she defied embodied the stark and often violent struggle between nascent Christian morality and the raw, untamed power of early medieval royalty. Number 1. The Frankish Queen and the Monk's Fiery Words. Brunhilde of Austrasia, Queen of the Franks, was a figure of immense power, political skill, and controversy in the early medieval period. Born a Visigothic princess around 543 CE, she married King Siegobert I of Austrasia. Her life was dominated by a brutal, decades-long feud with her sister-in-law, Fredegonde, a conflict that plunged the Frankish kingdoms into civil war. Yet beyond this dynastic struggle, Brunhilde also engaged in a significant and direct feud with prominent figures within the Church, particularly the fiery Irish missionary St. Columbanus over issues of royal morality, Eclenius de Tifri. She ruled as regent for her sons and grandsons for much of her long life, demonstrating formidable administrative abilities. She repaired roads, built churches, and attempted to restore order to the chaotic Frankish realm. However, her ruthless pursuit of power and her alleged moral transgressions often brought her into direct conflict with the reforming elements of the Church who sought to impose stricter Christian standards on the Frankish elite. The most famous clash came with Saint Columbanus, an Irish monk who had established monastic foundations across Gaul. Columbanus was known for his unyielding asceticism, his strict adherence to monastic rules, and his fearless condemnation of sin, even when committed by royalty. He believed that rulers, like all Christians, were subject to divine law and the moral authority of the Church. His arrival in the Frankish kingdoms represented a new, uncompromising brand of monasticism that often clashed with the more lax customs of the Frankish Church and court. The Vita Sancti Columbani, written by Jonas of Bobbio, provides a detailed, if hagiographical account of their confrontations. Columbanus specifically criticized Brunhilde's court for its moral laxity and what he perceived as its rampant immorality, condemned her son, King Theodoric II, for maintaining multiple mistresses rather than marrying legitimately, and providing legitimate heirs. This was a direct challenge to the Queen Mother, who wielded immense influence over her grandson. Columbanus's intervention was not merely a private rebuke, it was a public condemnation, challenging the very legitimacy of the royal household in the eyes of God. The feud intensified when Columbanus refused to bless Theodoric II's illegitimate children. This act was deeply insulting to Brunhilde and her grandson, as it denied the children the spiritual legitimacy that was so vital in a Christian kingdom. It was a direct assertion of the Church's moral authority over royal family matters. Columbanus insisted that the king should marry a legitimate queen and raise legitimate heirs following Christian principles of marriage. Brunhilde, accustomed to wielding absolute power, tried to pressure Columbanus into compliance. She reportedly visited his monastery at Luxeuil, attempting to charm or intimidate him. But Columbanus was unyielding. He openly challenged her power, telling her to abandon her sinful ways and urging Theodoric to marry a legitimate queen. His defiance was unprecedented. Brunhilde, exasperated by his obstinacy and his moral condemnations, eventually engineered his expulsion from Luxeuil and later his exile from the kingdom of Burgundy. This act of expelling a revered holy man, even one so troublesome, was a direct challenge to the Church's autonomy and the sanctity of its clergy. Brunhilde's feud with the Church was not limited to Columbanus. She was also criticized by other bishops for her alleged involvement in various murders and her ruthless political maneuvering. While some bishops supported her, particularly those she appointed, others, like Bishop Desiderius of Vienne, who criticized her rule, were reportedly victims of her wrath, with Desiderius eventually being stoned to death. Such acts, documented in contemporary chronicles, were viewed by the Church as grave sins and challenges to its moral authority. The Church, through its chroniclers and powerful figures, like Gregory of Tours, who was also a critic of Fredegund but a contemporary of Brunhilde, painted a complex picture of Brunhilde. While she was a formidable ruler, dedicated to order and reform, in some respects her methods and moral conduct were often deemed contrary to Christian teachings. Her long-standing habit of usurping royal authority and ruling through her young grandsons, as documented by sources like the Chronicle of Fredegar, was also a source of tension with elements of the Church who saw it as unnatural or illegitimate. Brunhilde's reign ended tragically in 613 CE, when she was captured by Clothar II, Fredegund's son, and brutally executed. Her long-standing feud with the Church, particularly with the unyielding Saint Columbanus, exemplifies the clash between the raw, often violent power of early medieval monarchy and the emerging moral and spiritual authority of the Church. Chumped as a queen who was determined to rule on her own terms, even when those terms directly challenged the fiery words and divine pronouncements of powerful men of God.